Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies special program, Neglecting Nostra Aetate, Antisemitism on the Catholic Far Right. I'm Dr. Benny Barlavi, and I'm the Maureen Douglas Core Visiting Chair in Jewish Thought and the Assistant Director of the Center for Jewish and Catholic Studies. And I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Dr. Matthew Tapie, Associate Professor of Theology and the Director of the CCJS. For those of you who might not know, especially friends turning in to the live stream tonight for the first time, St. Leo is the oldest Catholic institution of higher education in Florida, established in 1889 by the Order of St. Benedict of Florida, a Catholic religious order devoted to prayer, work, and hospitality. And the main campus is located just 40 minutes north of Tampa Bay. For almost 30 years, St. Leo's Center for Catholic Jewish Studies has provided interreligious educational programs for thousands of students and members of the community. And the mission of the CCJS is to build mutual respect, understanding, and appreciation among Jews, Catholics, and people of all goodwill by providing opportunities for interreligious education and dialogue. Now, concretely speaking, inspired by the Second Vatican Council, a new and positive framework for the Catholic Church's relationship with the Jewish people, the CCJS facilitates study and dialogue among Christians and Jews at the scholarly level through its publications, in the classroom through teaching and conversations, and in the local community through public programs just as this one. The center was established in 1998 through the joint efforts of St. Leo University, the American Jewish community, and several principal founders, including Rabbi James Rudin. Tonight's program is relevant to all of this on multiple levels. In recent years, there has been a very interesting phenomenon. There is a visible resurgence of a phenomenon that many people thought was long dead and buried, or at least under control. And I'm referring to anti-Semitism, especially among self-identified Catholics, particularly among those of the far right. And this program asks how such developments are possible among self-identified Catholics after the Second Vatican Council, and what they can reveal about the neglect, the misreading, the rejection, perhaps, of Nostra Aetate and subsequent magisterial teachings. And for that, I could think of no one better than Dr. Robert George, who will reflect on these developments with us and the theological and ideological currents that sustain them, and the ways in which they distort Catholic doctrine. Please send your questions through the Q&A. You can press on more on your Zoom and send us your questions through the Q&A. We're going to try to include them as part of tonight's program. So I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed speaker. Robert George is McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's a leading scholar of constitutional interpretation, civil liberties, moral and political philosophy, and has served as chair of the U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom. Professor George is author, among many other books, of Making Men Moral, In Defense of Natural Law, Conscience and Its Enemies, The Clash of Orthodoxies, Truth Matters, A Dialogue on Fruitful Disagreement in an Age of Division, among many other works. His articles have appeared in places such as Harvard Law Review, Yale Law Journal, with a review of politics, review of metaphysics, including also well-known newspapers such as the New York Times, Washington Post, and lately the Wall Street Journal. A graduate of Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School, Professor George holds degrees in philosophy and law from Oxford University, and in addition to 23 honorary degrees, he's a member of the American Academy of Sciences and Letters and the Council on Foreign Relations. So to get us started with the first question that sort of brought us all together here, what does the Catholic Church teach is about specifically the relationships to Jews and the relationships to Judaism. I mean, the Catholic Church has repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism, famously but not exclusively following Nostra Aetate, promulgated in Vatican II, has rejected the idea that God's covenant with the Jews has been revoked. This is also taught widely and has called for a renewed esteem for Jews and Judaism. And all of these are central conciliary and post-conciliary teachings. These are not marginal texts. So my question would be, why do so many Catholics today seem only very dimly aware of these teachings? Is this primarily a failure of the catechism, of preaching, or are we talking about something else?
Well, thank you for that question, Benny, and thanks to you, Benny, and to Matthew for the opportunity to join the program this evening. And thanks to you too, and congratulations to you for the important work that your center does, especially today. There are a few things that are more important than promoting interreligious harmony and interreligious cooperation. And to do that, we need to promote interreligious understanding. We need to understand each other and to appreciate each other and to learn from each other. And we do have a great deal to learn from each other. And your center is in the forefront of doing that. And I congratulate you for that. I congratulate St. Louis for hosting the center. Well, you articulated the developed teaching of the Catholic Church very well. Now let's look at this teaching in the historical context so that I can answer your specific questions. There's no denying that historically the Catholic Church took a generally negative attitude toward Jews and Judaism. Now, this was not racial anti-Semitism. That was never a major thing in the Catholic Church. But it was anti-Judaism. And it was not just ordinary lay Catholics, but even Catholic officials going all the way up to popes expressed anti-Jewish sentiments. The Church at the Second Vatican Council, and of course this is in the wake, let's remember when it is, 1965. This is within 20 years of the end of the Second World War and the Holocaust and the horrible the revelations of the horrible things that were done to Jewish people, not just Jewish people, but Jewish people in Nazi Germany, in Auschwitz and Birkenau and Dachau and so forth. The Church looked that history straight in the eye, and it repudiated it. And it repudiated it in no uncertain terms, condemning, Benny, not condemning you, but I'm saying, Benny, condemning anti-Semitism by anyone. See what that's a reference to? Catholics as well as non-Catholics. All the way up to bishops and popes. By anyone, anywhere, at any time. Not just today, going all the way back through history to the beginnings of that, in those days, tiny Jewish sect called Christianity. That was a beautiful, overdue, but beautiful teaching, because there is nothing in the gospel, properly understood, that could conceivably justify the contempt for, hatred toward the Jewish people that was too often expressed by Catholics, and sometimes indeed in the name of the church. So the first thing about the church's developed teaching on Judaism and on the Jewish people is the repudiation of anti-Semitism. Now, relatedly, Benny, the church in that document, Nostra Aetate, of the Second Vatican Council, 1965, made very clear, absolutely unambiguous, unequivocal, that the Jews corporately are not responsible for the death of Christ. So often, anti-Semitism took the form of taunts by Christians, including Catholics, regrettably, that the Jews killed Christ. I know people, I'm old enough to know people today, Jewish friends, elderly but nevertheless Jewish friends, who remember being taunted on the streets by Catholic fellow school children and being called Christ killers. The church unambiguously in Nostra Aetate condemns that kind of language, and not just the language, the thought behind it. The Jews corporately are not responsible for the death of Christ. You know who is responsible for the death of Christ? Everyone who ever committed a sin for which we need Christ's redemption. So the proper answer from a Catholic point of view is the one given by St. Francis to the question, who killed Christ? I did. Each of us say, as Christians, those of us who are Christians say, I did. We acknowledge that Christ needed to die for our sins. The atonement needed to happen. Redemption needed to happen, not because of some Jewish guy or Jewish ruler or priest or some Roman governor or somebody like that. That the real deep theological answer to the question is, I did. We did for our sins. Christ died for our sins. That's fundamental Christian teaching. So this abusive idea that the Jews killed Christ is totally repudiated. Moreover, anti-Semitism is not merely repudiated. It is itself condemned as sinful. It is a sin. It's not just impoliteness. It's not just bad manners. It's not just false. You can have false beliefs. It's not sinful. We all make mistakes. We all have some false beliefs in our heads. None of us has only true beliefs in our head. But it's sinful. It must not be indulged, much less acted upon by anyone at any time. It is sinful. Now, what else are we taught? Very importantly, we're taught in the document Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council, and Benny, you're absolutely right, this is a conciliar teaching. We're taught that the idea that God revoked his covenant with the Jewish people when the Jewish people did not corporately accept Christ as the Messiah promised to them. The document repudiates the idea that the covenant, God's covenant with the Jews, was revoked when they, quote unquote, they refused to accept Jesus as the Messiah. No. The correct teaching, now reinforced by successive popes, most particularly John Paul II and Benedict XVI, is the Jewish covenant with God. God's covenant with his people, with the Jewish people, is unbroken and unbreakable. Now, this is consistent with what it's sometimes thought to be inconsistent with, and that is the church's teaching that the church is the new Israel. That teaching does not entail that God has repudiated, cursed, turned against, condemns his chosen people, the original people. The people Pope John Paul II calls our brothers, indeed our elder brothers in faith. So these teachings have to be held side by side as consistent. Yes, the Gentile Christians are brought into the covenant, but the Jews are not repudiated and they are not replaced. That idea that the Jews are replaced sometimes goes by the label replacement theology. Church makes clear that's rejected. It sometimes goes by the label supersessionism or hard supersessionism. Again, that is not the teaching of the church. The ingrafting of the Gentiles is not the repudiation of the good olive tree on which the wild shoots of the Gentiles are grafted, to use the language quoted in Nostra Aetate. So, this means that the Jewish people do not have some status as has-beens, or that their relationship with God is broken. They remain in that covenantal relationship with God. And it's important for Jews and Christians to understand each other, to cooperate with each other, to deepen the bonds which Pope John Paul II calls spiritual bonds, linking the people of the ancient covenant, the original people of the covenant, with today's Christians. That this linkage needs to be deepened and more deeply understood. Now, that doesn't mean that there are two separate covenants, one for the Christians and one for the Jews. It's not an embracing here of so-called dual covenant theology. Nor does it mean the church rejects or repudiates, it couldn't possibly repudiate, its teaching that Jesus Christ is in fact the Messiah promised to the Jewish people. So if the question is, do Jews and Christians disagree on some important things like the messiahship of Jesus or like the doctrine of the Trinity? Well, yeah, Jews and Christians today do disagree on those things. Both can't be right. And by definition, in holding their beliefs, both sides think they're the side that's right about that particular issue. The law of non-contradiction continues to hold. And yet, perhaps mysteriously, the church sometimes uses this term to talk about the relationship of the Jewish people and the Christian church, and yet mysteriously we are bound together. We're more unified than we are disunited. And so that's why it's important for us to understand each other, appreciate each other, love each other, work together, not sacrificing our own integrity. If you believe Jesus is the Messiah promised to the Jews, that's what you believe. If you believe he's not, that's what you believe. That's a difference of opinion. That's for real, and it's about a very important issue. But that's not the end of the story. That's not the only truth. There's a much greater depth to it, a great mystery.
Um, and that great mystery has been taught by the Catholic Church in subsequent teachings. In 2015, the gifts are irrevocable, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's
Yet
another Vatican
that's
doc. It doesn't have the status of a conciliar document, but it's a document
right,
issued, with the approval of by the Holy See, actually, by, we
right
call the
by Pope
Vatican.
Francis.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right under that pontificate, but it's entirely consistent with what we have
Mhm.
from Pope Benedict, what we have from Pope John Paul the second, and of course, going all the way back then to Nostra Aetate. It's
Yeah,
also, Benny, um, uh, embraced and articulated in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the
right.
Universal Catechism, which was put together in the pontificate of Pope John Paul II. So, if you want to know what the Catholic Church teaches about Judaism and the Jewish people and the Church's relationship to Judaism and the Jewish people, all you need to do is go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which I wish my fellow Catholics would, which I particularly wish some of my fellow Catholics who have made themselves so-called influencers and who seem to be doing a lot of bad influencing would go and do. If they would simply read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it would enable them, if they were honest people, to stop misrepresenting the teaching of the Catholic Church on the
Right.
church's relationship to Jews and Judaism. It's put forward very clearly, very beautifully in the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
So this brings me to my next question, which is more, I guess, sociological. We're going to be back to theology, don't worry. But you've explained that there is a resurgence of anti-Semitism, specifically, by the way, among young men. So my question is, from a sociological perspective, how broad is this phenomenon that what you've described and we are very well aware of? And are we talking about here an online fringe of influencers, as you call them, or maybe bots or algorithmic incrementation, or something that reaches more deeply into parishes and seminaries and schools and maybe the mainstream Catholic media? In other words, are we talking about a loud minority, or is there evidence that something more deeply is happening?
Well, fortunately, at least for now, it is by no means majority. This is not the mainstream position among Catholics. God bless them, our bishops, and Matthew probably knows I haven't always been gentle with our bishops. I've occasionally found occasion to be somewhat critical of our bishops, but God bless our bishops. They have been very good on this issue. They're not the problem, quite the reverse. They have articulated and re-articulated the teaching, the honest, actual, authentic teaching of the Catholic Church on this, and I just wish more Catholics would listen to them. But it's not a majority among the Catholic faithful. Most Catholics are not guilty of anti-Semitism. Most Catholics have a positive attitude toward Jews and Judaism, the attitude that the church enjoins us to take in the Catechism, in the other documents you mentioned, in Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council, in the teachings of John Paul II and Benedict and the other popes. And yet, Benny, anti-Semitism is there. It's there among Catholics, especially but not exclusively among younger Catholics, most especially, though not exclusively, among young Catholic men. Now, I need to confess here that I'm one of those people you were talking about at the beginning in your comments when you opened this webinar, Benny. I thought anti-Semitism was dead and buried with a stake through that vampire's heart. It wasn't. It wasn't. For years, I thought that. Until very recently, I thought that. I grew up in the wake of World War II. My father served in Normandy and Brittany. My father was with one of the divisions or groups of soldiers that was sent in by Eisenhower to see, it was a particular camp, so that no one could claim that the Holocaust hadn't happened, that the atrocities that the Germans committed hadn't actually been committed. And for those of us who grew up as baby boomers, and I think into the next generation beyond, grew up with the memories of that horrible atrocity committed against the Jewish people, and not exclusively, but with the Jewish people as a central, if not the central target. And we had sympathy. And we were asked by the church to remember that though that monster Hitler hated Christianity, nevertheless, it was Christian anti-Judaism, in some cases anti-Semitism. Didn't find that much among Catholics, but anti-Judaism or hostile attitudes toward Jews and Judaism that helped to create the all too fertile soil for something like Hitler to happen. The church faced up to that, and Catholics faced up to that. So for my father's generation, for my generation, for my children's generation, anti-Semitism was a horrific thing, out of the question. We didn't want anywhere near that stuff. Horrible. Identified with the worst in human nature and the worst human beings, Hitler and people like him. So I thought we were done with it and we move on to other challenges. We do have a lot of other challenges, a lot of bad stuff, a lot of bad belief, a lot of bad things done because of bad beliefs. But I didn't think anti-Semitism was going to be something we would have to deal with, at least not in the Catholic Church here in the United States of America. But here we are. Here we are. Now, again, it's not the majority, but it's no longer merely fringe. Characters who seemed very fringy as recently as 2 years ago now have followings. There are people who we can no longer dismiss as just fringy. There are people who are listening to them, many more people listening to them than were listening to them even 2 years ago. And we have new people who nobody had ever heard of, or at least people who hadn't been weighing in with anti-Semitic rants who are now not only engaging in that nonsense, but being listened to sometimes by very large followings. And some of them purport to speak, if not in the name of the church, speak as articulators of authentic Catholic dogma. Now, anybody, all you have to do to see that that's not true is open the Catechism. And the Catechism is written for everybody. It's not an academic text. The whole point of having a catechism is so that everybody, ordinary people, can look and see, what the Catholic Church teaches about this, Catholics and others alike. And yet, so many people seem to be believing what some of these either misinformed or ill-motivated so-called influencers are saying, which means we've got to deal with the problem. We cannot wish it away. I wish we could. We cannot say, oh, it's fringe. It's just a fad. It'll go away tomorrow. It's not going to. It needs to be responded to. So I, in my own work, I hope other lay Catholics, especially my fellow scholars, lay Catholic scholars, would do that. I've already thanked the bishops because I think the bishops are being wonderful on this. There was a magnificent statement by Archbishop Sample from Portland, Oregon, I believe, or am I confusing him? Is either Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington, one of the great North uh, uh, Pacific Coast, Pacific Northwest states. Archbishop Sample, magnificent video that he put out, simply articulating in a beautiful way the Catholic teaching on the church's relationship with Jews and Judaism, the condemnation of anti-Semitism, the repudiation of the charge of deicide against the Jews, the affirmation that Jews are indeed our brothers in faith. Pope Benedict at one point changed the language slightly to say our fathers in faith, the people who had that core faith, the faith of Abraham before there was any such thing as Christianity as a recognizable religion before the coming of Jesus. So I think that's where we are at the moment, and we can't afford to just sit back and hope it'll go away. We're going to have to speak out, and that extends not simply to the bishops and the clergy, but to all of us who are faithful Catholics. Now, you might ask the question, well, why don't more Catholics understand their faith? Here, Benny, I can assure you, this is not a matter of selective ignorance. It's not just that Catholics happen not to know anything or know much, at least many Catholics don't know anything or don't know much about the teaching of the church on the church's relationship with Jews and Judaism. So many Catholics don't know much about anything about their faith, and I'm embarrassed as a Catholic to say that the majority of Catholics don't know what the Catholic Church's teaching is on the sacrament of the Eucharist. You know, most Catholics today don't know that the Catholic Church teaches there are seven sacraments. Most Catholics couldn't name the seven sacraments. So we have a general problem with our Catholic faithful not being knowledgeable. Too many Catholics, and here the church really was in need of reform and remains in need of reform, think that the theological stuff is for the bishops and the clergy, and they'll take care of that. And, you know, our job is to show up in church on Sunday, you know, not commit mortal sins, contribute money to the collection, contribute a little extra money to the church's society organizations to help poor people or victims of addictions and things like that. But a lot of Catholics think it's not important for us to know actually the teaching of the church on its doctrinal matters, and that's just unfortunate. So to use the Catholic terminology, what we need, Benny, is catechesis. And there, you know, the bishops, I think, do have some responsibility. I mean, first they need to insist on catechesis, and then they need to,
Mhm.
you know, be in the forefront and in their supervisory roles when it comes to the parishes of making sure that it's provided and provided soundly. You know, one other thing, I'll get a little controversial here, but I think I have to for the sake of the truth. Um, the Second Vatican Council, as you made very clear yourself, and you're absolutely right, Benny, is very central here because the Second Vatican Council clarified some stuff that needed to be clarified. It didn't change any doctrines.
Right.
It was never a matter of doctrine that that Catholics had to be anti-Jewish. That was never taught. That was never a matter of church doctrine. Um, but so it had to clarify a lot of things. So it did that clarification and articulated these teachings. It settled some things that were kind of up in the air in the minds of a lot of Catholics that hadn't been definitively very forcefully taught by the church. But in the wake of the council, a lot of Catholics of a more liberal or progressive disposition
Mm.
shifted the focus from the actual teachings of the Second Vatican Council in all the great documents, not just Nostra Aetate, not just Dignitatis Humanae on religious liberty, but in the documents known as Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes, the dogmatic constitutions and so forth. A lot of people on the liberal or progressive side tried to sort of underplay the actual words, the literal texts of the Second Vatican Council, and to promote what they called the spirit of the council, the spirit of Vatican II. And they began to propose all sorts of things that were literally contrary to Catholic teaching in the moral domain and in the disciplinary domain and in other domains, as if they were somehow what the Vatican Council was all about. Well, they weren't about those things. They weren't about, the ordination of women. They weren't about changing the church's teaching on sexual morality or marriage. The spirit of Vatican II stuff, that was just a lot of nonsense. They were actually about what the texts said. And that's what I think we now have to get people to look at. We don't need them to speculate about what, the future implications of any of this will be. We just need to get them to read the text, look at the text. And it will help if the parish clergy would preach on the texts. You're always got to teach on the gospel and the other readings at a Catholic Mass, Benny. We read from the gospel, and we also read generally from one of the Old Testament documents, what the Christians call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and then the letters of the New Testament, especially, not exclusively the letters of that um, uh, Jewish Christian named St. Paul. But while teaching, consistently with the Scripture and elucidating and illuminating the Scripture, I think it would be very valuable for parish clergy, parish priests, to find every occasion to instruct the faithful on the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, including Nostra Aetate, including the sections of Nostra Aetate that are on the Church's understanding of and relationship with the Jewish people.
Um, I have a sort of follow-up question to this. I agree that there is a lot of ignorance both on the right and on the left regarding Nostra Aetate and Vatican II, but one of the striking features, I think, of the resurgence of anti-Semitism on the right is that many of these people present themselves as defenders of tradition, people who are very suspicious of Vatican II, who are very sometimes attached to the Latin Mass, who are convinced that they are resisting an onslaught of secularism, decline, nihilism, doctrinal collapse. And it seems to me that some are entering into old forms of anti-Semitism through, as it were, the door of anti-modernism. So, how does a perceived crisis of Catholic identity, which I think this is we're talking about, can become a vehicle for anti-Jewish attitudes? Is this endeavor to defend what seems as tradition against modernity? Can we decouple that from anti-Judaism, or is anti-Judaism one of the integral components of this whole phenomenon?
I wish I actually knew the answer to that question, Benny. I don't. My best guess is that it's both cause and effect, that these are related. It can't be reduced to just one or the other, just the effect of an anti-modernist attitude, or the cause of a broader kind of rejection of the council. Um, it's really important. I would plead with my fellow Catholics, please do not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's some bathwater that needs to be thrown out. There's some stuff that entered into the church, not as a result of the letter of Vatican II, Benny. Here again, rather as the result of the so-called, this phony, hoped up spirit of Vatican II. If people wonder, I'm embarrassed to say this, Benny, if people wonder how we got clown masses and stuff like that, I hope you don't know what a clown mass is. It would please me if you didn't. So,
I
and I'm
do, I
not.
do.
Oh, you do. I regret that as well because that's also embarrassing, and a lot of bad stuff that it goes has gone on liturgically and otherwise. It was in the name of the spirit of Vatican II, not the actual text of the council, that this bad stuff happened, and it scandalized people. And here you got the left and the right both implicated in this. People on the left push this stuff. Not all people. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here. There are progressive Catholics who don't go for clown masses and that kind of stuff. Um, but there are people who push this spirit of Vatican II stuff. And then you have conservatives who thought, well, yeah, that must be what Vatican II is about. They bought the liberals' line on what Vatican II was. The difference was the progressive people said, isn't this great? And the conservative people said, what a nightmare. Uh, but the truth is they're both wrong about what Vatican II was about. Vatican II is about what it says. it's what the texts actually say. It's not this stuff that was proposed, usually from the left, as being the implications or the spirit of Vatican II. Now, I don't want to, again, paint with too broad a brush. It would be terrible to suggest that all or even most, Benny, of the people who support the traditional Latin Mass are anti-Semites. They're not, or even opposed to the Second Vatican Council broadly. They are not. Now, I myself am a Novus Ordo, as we call it, church attender. So the masses I go to on a regular basis of the Novus Ordo. It's not that I have any problem with the traditional Latin Mass. I don't. It's very beautiful. It was the Mass that I remember from my boyhood, when I was an altar boy, when I was about 6 years old, I guess. I was an altar boy at the traditional Latin Mass. I can remember Matthew saying the prayers with the priest at the foot of the altar, the Confiteor, and so forth in Latin. And it is very beautiful. There's no question it's beautiful. And for many people, it's really important to their spirituality. So I want them to have the opportunity to enjoy that. I know how spiritually uplifting and edifying it is for them. Let's not repudiate the Latin Mass. Um, but, at the same time, uh, those on the sort of those with the devotion to the Latin Mass must take the same attitude. I think they're enjoined to take the same attitude toward people who prefer the Novus Ordo, who attend for whatever reasons the new Mass, the vernacular Mass with the new rite. They're both valid masses. They both have meaning for the people who especially appreciate the particular style or rite of Mass. Um, so I'm here for a spirit of ecumenism, and breadth and tolerance, within the big. It turns out that orthodoxy is a big tent. There's room for the people who prefer the Latin Mass and the traditional rite, what we call the extraordinary form today, and there's room for people who appreciate the Novus Ordo. There's lots of room for lots of different spiritualities and expressions of our religious life within Catholicism. Catholicism really is a big tent. That doesn't mean anything goes. I've already given you a sense of what I think about clown masses and stuff that undermine the reverential attitude that we need to take toward the liturgy, whether it's the Novus Ordo or the traditional Latin Mass, the extraordinary form. But I do think for those who are of the more traditionalist bent, I think it's important for them to be on the lookout for people who are in their communities who are promoting ideas that are contrary to the teachings of the church, including, since they are the teachings of the church, those of the Second Vatican Council, including the church's teachings on religious liberty, including the church's teachings on her relationship to an understanding of Jews and Judaism. Is that, I don't want to dodge your question. Has that been responsive to your question?
Oh, I think it has, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Well, thanks.
Benny, do you mind if I follow up on that one quickly? Thank you, Dr. George. I'm curious about the notion about presenting the faith. How must Catholics present the faith today? How must they teach the Catholic faith to young people? I've spoken at a few Catholic universities. And I had one experience at a point where the students seemed to not be aware at all of the Second Vatican Council. And they were presented, it seemed to be that maybe perhaps they took certain classes that introduced them to the church fathers, and they had other, essential theological courses, but these were somehow disconnected from the Second Vatican Council's teachings in a way that seemed to be disjointed. And so they were surprised to hear about Nostra Aetate and its teachings. And it presented to them a positive picture of Judaism that was surprising to them. So I was wondering if you could comment on this idea of maybe being insufficiently grounded in the Catholic faith, and what sort of pedagogical approach should we take for young Catholics with regard to the tradition? How do they wrestle with a collective guilt charge in the church fathers that we see emerging in some of the language of the church fathers, or maybe even in Augustine? And then we have
Mhm.
Second Vatican Council. And I think that's some of the challenge. for the younger.
Yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, I want our young people to understand the church fathers because they're very important and they have an awful lot to teach us. Some of the attitudes expressed by the fathers toward the Jews are bad, and they have been overcome in Catholic teaching. They have not been embraced. Not everything the church fathers this or that particular church father taught has become the teaching of the Catholic Church. I mean, even St. Augustine doesn't dictate what the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas doesn't dictate what the teaching of the Vatican of the Catholic Church is. You might consider some of his ideas on Marian doctrines, which are not what the Church ended up embracing. Um, so yeah, I want our young people. In fact, I lit up a little when you said you were talking to young people who had been taught the church fathers. I'm thinking, whoa, that's great. I mean, not all that many young people today, including young Catholics, are exposed to, well, Saint Augustine, Irenaeus, Tertullian, all of the church fathers. Um, on the other hand, uh, if you just teach part of the story, you don't teach the developed teaching of the Catholic Church. It's been a couple of thousand years, and the teaching has developed on how the development occurs. We can do no better than, look at the work on the development of doctrine of the great English theologian and churchman, John Henry Newman. Um, and so, what has unfolded as the church looks into her treasury, where she finds both old things and new, that's the teaching of the Second Vatican Council itself. What we have is the developed teaching of the church, responding to what turn out to be errors, correcting, clarifying. So, yes, read the church fathers, absolutely. Read the great medieval thinkers. Read Aquinas, definitely. Read the great figures of the Reformation era and the era and the Renaissance. Read Erasmus. Read Thomas More. Read John Henry Newman. From the 19th century, but also read the encyclicals of Leo the 13th and Benedict the 14th and Pius the 11th and Pius the 12th and John the 23rd and Paul the 6th and John Paul the 2nd and Benedict and up to our current pontiff, of course, Pope Leo the 14th. So an only partially educated person can sometimes prove that a little learning is a dangerous thing, because you could mistake, for example, anti-Jewish sentiments in the writings of a church father, say Justin Martyr, for the teaching of the church. But it's not the teaching of the church. In fact, it's been repudiated. Now, that doesn't mean been repudiated by the church. Now, that doesn't mean that means there's nothing to learn from Justin Martyr. He was a human being like other human beings. He was a frail, fallen, fallible creature like you and me. He made mistakes the same way we make mistakes. He was also very brilliant and a very dedicated Christian. And whatever mistakes he made have to be then looked at in light of the elucidation of the teaching of the gospel that he was able to do in some other areas. And it's like that for anyone. It's like that if we look at Aquinas. It's like that if we look at Erasmus. It's like that if we look at John Henry Newman. The key thing is to remember that the church's teaching is not the teaching of any particular individual. No individual gets to dictate the church's teaching. It's the church herself. And she does have this treasury that she can consult, but to find old things and new. I think that's a beautiful image, and I think it's absolutely true. So what do we have with the developed teaching of the church today when it comes to Jews and Judaism? We have exactly what Benny articulated at the very beginning and what I then reinforced.
Thank you very much.
I have a sort of follow-up question. I think it would be comfortable for many people to locate the problem of anti-Semitism on the right, with traditionalists, integralists, conservatives of all sort. But anti-Jewish structures and anti-Semitic structures can also appear on the left and on the Catholic left, often dressed in the language of human rights, of sort of solidarity, anti-colonialism, ecology, and so on and so forth. So what would you say that distinguishes political legitimate criticism, especially of
Yeah.
Israel, from a discourse that is still and very often unknowingly shaped by older anti-Jewish assumptions.
Okay. Benny, I would plead with my fellow Catholics, this is not hard. Let me just tell you what everybody already knows. I'm going to repeat it anyway because maybe people need to hear it. Okay. It is wrong to equate anti-Semitism with criticism of the government of Israel. If you're critical of the government of Israel, any government of Israel, that doesn't make you an anti-Semite. If it made you an anti-Semite, then there would be a lot of Jewish people, including a lot of Israeli Jews who are anti-Semites, because Israeli Jews criticize their government more than we criticize our government, and we criticize our government an awful lot. Not because we're anti-Americans, on the contrary, right? So anti uh, criticism of the Israeli government or the actions of the state of Israel is not anti-Semitism. Now, having said that, very clearly, having said that, it is also true that sometimes, as you yourself just suggested, Benny, anti-Semitism masquerades, it hides behind the mask of criticism of the Israeli government or the Israeli state. And that's wrong. Anti-Semitism is wrong. It's sinful according to the teaching of the Catholic Church, whether it is explicit or whether it's dressed up as something else. Now, remember, having now said that, that again doesn't mean that any criticism of Israel or the Israeli government is anti-Semitism. It's not. There's legitimate criticism of the Israeli government. And then there's this other thing, which is anti-Jewish sentiment masquerading as mere criticism of the Israeli government. I noticed this rising on the left long before any of this stuff on the right started happening. I warned to a group of Jewish philanthropists in New York who are interested in higher education. I think as early as about 2011 or 2012, I was speaking to a group there, and I said, I see just below the surface where I live in academia, something that I didn't see when I began my career in 1985. And that is not only virulent hostility to Israel, but anti-Semitism masquerading as criticism of Israeli policy. Now, the church, again, couldn't be clearer about this. The church has given us wonderful guidance here. The church says, of course, you can criticize politicians. Of course, you can criticize governments. Of course, you can criticize the policy of this state or that state, whether it's the United States of America or Uruguay or Spain or Israel or Iran. But the hatred of people, contempt for people, is the opposite of Christian love. It's the opposite of the love of Christ. That kind of bigotry against anybody is out of bounds, at least as far as Catholics are concerned, at least as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, is out of bounds. So all it takes is paying attention to some very simple distinctions that we all understand. Now, having said that, it is true that sometimes there's ambiguity. Sometimes you'll hear a rather harsh criticism of Israel, and you'll wonder what's really going on here. Is that just anti-Semitism masquerading as harsh criticism of Israel? And I think the way to test that when you experience that, so that you can make a judgment, is to ask, is the person who is articulating that hostility saying the same thing about other governments who are engaged in the same activity or worse? If you castigate the Israeli government for something that you give a pass to when it is the government of some other state, perhaps a state that's hostile to Israel, then I have to suspect the only difference between the two cases is that Israel is a Jewish state. And then I think, smells bad to me. On the other hand, if you have a genuine human rights activist who says, we're critical of the Israeli policy on this particular issue, we think it's unfair, say, to the Palestinian minority, but these same human rights people are saying the same things about other governments' mistreatment of minorities, say the Pakistani government treating mistreating of the Ahmadiyya minority, then I say this is a person of integrity. Now, I might agree with the criticism or disagree with the criticism, but then I won't suspect that the criticism is rooted in or is masquerading, is a masquerade for anti-Semitism. Does that help, Benny?
I think that's a very coherent answer. So
Okay.
yeah, well,
To follow up on that, Dr. George, can you elaborate maybe on our current situation with anti-Semitism rising on the left and right? In some of the uh, dialogues I've been in with my Jewish colleagues, there's a sense, perhaps in Jewish neighbors, there's a sense in which they feel surrounded on all sides from
Oh, yeah.
different criticism, and not just criticism, but violent attack. And political violence on the rise as well. So when you compare these forms of anti-Semitism, what do you see as the important differences? Are we dealing with one phenomenon in two political idioms, or with a meaningfully different structure of thought?
My guy, again, I wish I knew the answer. Here's my best guess. I think it's basically the same thing. It is a kind of predisposition to a conspiratorial view that the Jews are really behind the bad things that are happening, but it is expressed in one case of the idiom of the left and the other case the idiom of the right. And there's historical precedent for this again on both sides. But I think the thing that is in common is that it's those Jews, or at least people who are Jews, if not all Jews, who are getting us into wars and are, running the pornography business and are doing behind this bad thing and that bad thing. And, it might be male pattern baldness. So it's the Jews who created male pattern baldness or addicting people to drugs or, whatever it is. That's a kind of constant through history. We were blessedly free of it in the United States, or more or less free. It was just marginal, as we said earlier, on both the right and the left. And it began, some years ago, as I said, noticing on the left, and then just in the last year or so, this revival on the right, including among Catholics. Again, it's a minority. It is not the majority of Catholics. Benny, I want to assure you and our other Jewish friends from the inside, this is not, you need not be afraid of your Catholic neighbors. Most Catholics have an excellent, a wonderful, a loving attitude toward our Jewish brothers. But there is a fringe. It's more our responsibility to deal with it than it is your responsibility to deal with it. We are in a position to deal with it. We can call our fellow Catholics out for being bad Catholics, for having these attitudes. I think it's easier for us to do than for you to do. And so we've got to do it. It's our responsibility to do it. But our Jewish brothers need to know we are doing it. They need to know we're standing with them. They need to know we're behind them. And again, God bless the bishops because they are making that clear.
Thank you.
I was wondering, Matt, if there's any questions we want to ask from the audience. We've had some really great questions. Um, Anything in particular, Matt, or I'll...
Let's see here. We have one from Hogan Heritage. Asks Prejean Bowler and her newness to the faith, but the presence of a cardinal's speech at the award event and the events that led to your resignation from the Heritage Foundation with a former president of a Catholic university are just two events that seem to suggest things are worse than previously thought. Why
Oh,
are
yeah. Yeah, they are.
why are some leaders finding themselves in such close proximity to these sorts of things? Do you think that the issues here might extend wider than just the Catholic far right in America and deeper than just Nostra Aetate, seemingly extending to an attempted re-narration of Vatican II?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the last part of the question. What I'm seeing on the right side, left's got its own problems. What I'm seeing on the right side, where I'm seeing a problem, is not a re-narration of Vatican II, it's a repudiation of Vatican II. And in particular, repudiation of two documents both declarations, not dogmatic constitutions, but one is Dignitatis Humanae, which affirms the robust conception of religious liberty. And then the second is Nostra Aetate. And interestingly, the criticism of Nostra Aetate is not just that people don't like its teaching on Jews and Judaism. They also don't like its teaching on the church's desire to cooperate with Muslims.
Mm.
Oh, and not just with Muslims. So it also talks about or affirming all that is true and holy in the teachings of the Eastern religions, even though they are not part of the great monotheistic traditions. And some people, some critics of Nostra Aetate say, "Oh, this is the church throwing out the first commandment against idol worship. That you're embracing paganism." But the church isn't doing that. I mean, what the church is saying is that the church repudiates or rejects nothing that is true and holy
Only.
in the religious spirit. And Nostra Aetate begins by saying that even apart from any exposure to, much less understanding of monotheistic religion, the human being, maybe in a very primitive society, still somehow perceives that there's something greater than the material world. And in that, those initial kinds of religious sentiments or perceptions, he's already on the path looking for God. He realizes there's something more. It's not just this material stuff. I can't just live for myself in the satisfaction of my own desires. There's something beyond us, maybe even something like a father, something like that. Yeah, I mean, why shouldn't the church affirm all that is true and holy in the non-Christian religions? Why does Catholicism think it's got to have a monopoly on the truth, that it's the only institution that knows any truth? Obviously, a lot of what Catholics teach are taught by other religions, and not just our mother religion, Judaism, but even the Eastern religions. Now, for my having said that, there will be some people who are going to castigate me and say I'm a religious relativist. I'm guilty of religious indifferentism. I've gone over to the pagans, but I'm just articulating what the church quite sensibly teaches.
Thank you very much, Dr. George. Another attendee asks, in light of Nostra Aetate, how should we interpret the gospel passages that critique the Pharisees in
Oh,
Matthew and in John so that we can respect the text while avoiding interpretations that could foster anti-Jewish attitudes?
that's an excellent question. And when those texts are read at the gospel, in those texts, not just the gospel, but those gospel and other texts that are read at Mass, I know that the priest can't every time put them in their historical context and explain them. So I always worry that any Jewish guests who might be at the Mass, whether they happen to be my own guests or other people, will be hurt by them. And that's why it's important for us Catholics to understand, in part so that we can explain it to our Jewish friends, the historical context of these documents. Jesus obviously gets into conflict with the authorities of his time, with the Jewish authorities of his time, with the elite of his time, the Pharisees, for example. He obviously gets into a lot of conflict with the high priest, with Caiaphas, and with them. Yeah, that's the historical picture, but then there's the spiritual meaning. Those Pharisees are us at our worst. The reason the gospel records those to send the message is not to condemn Judaism at all. Jesus is a faithful Jew. He was and is and always will be, right? So it's not to condemn Judaism, it's to condemn hypocrisy. And it wasn't to condemn all the Pharisees. Some of Jesus' own teachings are teachings that are associated with actually the Pharisaical tradition in Judaism. When you hear that today, you might be shocked because you've come to identify Pharisaism with the thing Jesus criticizes, with the hypocrisy and so forth. But he was just criticizing the particular people, not their actual beliefs. He was saying, no, actually be more faithful to your beliefs, not be less. The beliefs aren't the problems. I've come to fulfill the law, not to abolish the law. Not an iota of the law will be abolished. I've come to fulfill. Um, so it's those attitudes that Jesus is here condemning. Don't be a hypocrite. Don't condemn somebody when you yourself are guilty of sinning. When the group is going to stone the woman caught in the very act of adultery, what does Jesus say? Let you who are without sin throw the first stone. You think that's a teaching about Judaism? No, it's not a condemnation of Judaism. It's not a condemnation of the Jewish law, actually. It's a condemnation of the hypocrisy. Yeah, you're going to stone her. What about your own heart? What about the things you've done? When Jesus teaches anybody who's looked at a woman lustfully has committed adultery in his heart, you show me what man hasn't done that. Jesus is teaching us. If you want to say he's got a target, we're it. And not just to condemn us, thank God, much as we may deserve it. No, it's to reform us, to bring us to repentance so that we can ourselves embody and exemplify and model the love of Christ, which is what the gospel is all about, the gospel of love.
Thank you, Dr. George. Another question is from an attendee who asks, or actually shares that they are in seminary formation. They form seminarians. They're working with first-year seminarians, some of whom are young men drawn to figures promoting Christian nationalism. And so he's wondering, how problematic is this for priestly formation, and what are constructive ways a formation director might redirect them toward a more authentically Catholic political theology?
Oh, very good. Okay, first I want to say thank you to this young man. I assume he's young, although our clergy now are drawn from sometimes the older ranks. But thank you for following your vocation and serving the church as a priest. That's a wonderful thing. We obviously, in this country and in the West generally, have a great need for vocations, and thank you for helping to fill that need. God bless you. I again don't want to paint with too broad a brush. We mustn't suggest that integralists are all anti-Semites. They are not. That Catholics who follow the school of political theology called integralism. Nor does not being an integralist guarantee they're not going to be an anti-Semite. We have plenty of anti-Semites of all sorts of political views or views about the relationship of ecclesiastical and civic authority. Same for so-called Christian nationalism. First of all, that is a label that names many different things. There's not a canonical definition of Christian nationalism. Before I ever answer a question on Christian nationalism, I need to know, well, what exactly do you mean by Christian nationalism? Or do you mean this thing, or do you mean that thing, or do you mean the other thing? All of which go by the name of Christian nationalism. Now, plenty of forms of Christian nationalism are not infected by this virus of anti-Semitism. So again, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, although they're not schools that I myself subscribe to. I reject the Christian nationalist idea in any of the versions that I have encountered. But the seminarian is right. There are people who identify as integralists or as Christian nationalists in the Catholic world, including in the seminaries, who do embrace, I think, inauthentic ideas that are not authentically Catholic ideas, and in many cases, such as anti-Semitism, simply incompatible with Catholic teaching. First thing you need to do in order to deal with the problem, if you're a seminary director or a formation director or a spiritual advisor or spiritual director, is recognize you got a problem. You might want to wish you didn't have a problem. You might be tempted to pretend we don't have a problem in order to ignore it so you won't have to deal with it. Sorry, you've got to deal with it. And this is a retail business and not just a wholesale business. Yes, you can speak in groups. You can speak when you're preaching, at the Mass for the seminarians or in classes or whatever. But I do think that's the wholesale treatment, but I think it needs retail as well. In other words, it's one-on-one with the individual men where you make clear that when you become a priest, you will be speaking not on your own authority, but on the authority of your bishop. Your bishop speaks really not on his own authority, but on the authority of Jesus Christ. Your job is to teach what Jesus teaches as understood by and articulated by the Catholic Church. That means you are to teach what it says in the Catechism, in Nostra Aetate, in the encyclical letters of John Paul II and Benedict XVI and the others, the developed teaching of the Catholic Church. When you teach other than that, you are not teaching the gospel of Christ. You're teaching the gospel of Robbie or Jim or Joe or Bob. You have no authority as Robbie or Jim or Joe or Bob. You only have authority, derivative of your bishop's authority, derivative of Christ's authority, to teach what the Catholic Church teaches. And the Catholic Church simply, to go back to Benny's original opening, has simply stated clearly what its teaching is. You can't misunderstand it these days. You just open the catechism. You can't mistake it. You can reject it, but then you're outside the Catholic domain. You can't mistake it because it's clear. The Jews haven't been replaced. They are not guilty corporately for the death of Christ. Anti-Semitism is a sin and a grave sin by anybody, anywhere, at any time. I don't know how you can get clearer.
Thank you, Dr. George. Since it's such a timely topic, and since I think in the same way that some Catholics might be entering anti-Semitic ideas through the door of anti-modernity or anti-modernism, some may be also doing this through different forms of nationalism and xenophobia. Can you share just briefly why you reject Christian nationalism? You said you reject it. Why would that be? Maybe this would be helpful for the seminary director of formation who asked the question.
Yeah, it's my understanding of the church's witness when it comes to the independence of the civic and ecclesiastical authorities. Um, uh, there are misinterpretations of the American constitutional doctrine of separation of church and state. Those words actually don't appear in the Constitution. They were drawn by people interpreting the Constitution from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to a congregation, a Baptist congregation in Danbury, Connecticut. And the Constitution's actual principles in this area, characterized as the separation of church and state area, have been very badly misrepresented by a lot of progressives for a long time, going all the way back to the original interpretations of the so-called Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, going back to 1947, case that happened just down the road from where I'm sitting right now in Ewing Township, New Jersey, case versus called Everson, the Everson decision. And that is a radical separation. That misreading of the Constitution is a radical separation of church and state that basically tries to privatize religion, remove religion from the public domain to the purely private sphere around the table at mealtime or on your knees at bedtime or in the church or synagogue or mosque or temple to sort of evacuate public life of religious content. I reject that. I think it's very bad constitutional doctrine, but even more broadly, I think it's very bad political philosophy and political theology. I think the church has to be bearing prophetic witness. Other religious communities should be bearing prophetic witness in the public square. Otherwise, you can't account for Martin Luther King or much of any of the other great reformers of American history. Now, at the same time, I think a sound understanding of the relationship of church and state, certainly a Catholic understanding and the developed teaching of the Catholic Church, recognizes the valid separation of the institutions of the church from the institutions of the state. So I would favor a polity in which no one holds ecclesiastical office in virtue of a political appointment. No one holds, say, the office of bishop because a president has appointed him to be bishop. And by the same token, no one should hold political office in virtue of an ecclesiastical appointment. The Bishop of Rochester shouldn't get to appoint the senator from New York or something like that. That's a legitimate separation of civic and ecclesiastical authority that works to the benefit of both, but most importantly, over the long run, protects the autonomy and integrity and authority of the church, which otherwise will be commandeered to become an arm of the state. And we've seen this throughout history, pretty much across the globe. Look at the situation in Russia, whether it's the czars, whether it's Stalin, whether it's Putin. When you have a melding together of church and state, who loses? It's not that the church calls the tune. It's the church that loses and is subordinated to the state. And so that's why I don't want any kind of Christian nationalism if what that means is we lose this legitimate separation of church and state. Not the phony separation of church and state that is just an attempt to create an American version of French laïcité. I think that's a very bad system. That's establishing a religion. It just happens to be the religion of secularism. So again, I think the authentic, sound Catholic understanding here is one that does recognize there are two kingdoms, there are two swords, and that these have a legitimate autonomy and integrity. And while they're not radically separated so that one can never influence the other or anything like that, there is nevertheless a principled distinction that is maintained.
Thank you, Dr. George. Excellent. Very helpful. So it looks like we have time for one final question. And so I'll ask that, and then we'll go ahead and close the program. And Benny, of course, if you have any other comments too, please feel free to jump in. The last question is from Gina Christian. She asks, she says, you'd mentioned that this anti-Judaism is seen particularly in some young men. Do you have any thoughts on why this particular demographic is prone to this trend? Many thanks.
Okay, yeah. We got a lot of problems today. I mean, as a university professor, I can tell you, and if one of my liberal colleagues were here, he or she could tell you, there's a lot of problems with our young people today. Now, there are a lot of great things about our young people today, but there are also a lot of problems. For our girls, for our young women, there are serious mental health issues. The scope of mental health problems among our young women is really much more significant than it ever has been in my 4 decades now of academic experience. My university's president, President Eisgruber, who has a very different political outlook from my own, would tell you exactly the same thing. I know that because he's told me exactly the same thing. So we have problems there, and that seems to be especially intense, especially large problem among more progressive and secular progressive women, young women. The accessing of mental health resources by young women who need it is disproportionately weighted toward girls who are more progressive and basically secular. It's not that we don't have problems among more conservative women or more religious women, but it's not as pronounced as we have among more secular and progressive women. But I have not noticed among the more liberal women by and large, but certainly not among the more conservative women, a problem with anti-Semitism. Our Catholic female students at Princeton, not a single case can I think of a woman that I'm worried about because she's falling down into the ditch of anti-Semitism. Just not something I see. It's not that it's not out there. We all know of female influencers and other female personalities who've been right in the middle of the worst of this stuff. But I don't see it as nearly pronounced a problem as I see it on the male side. Now, it's not to say that you don't have mental health issues on the male side. You do, but they're less pronounced. The percentages are lower than they are on the female side. But you do have other problems. You've got serious problems with pornography use and pornography addiction, and that's not unconnected to some of the other pathologies that our young men are experiencing, including anti-Semitism. Young men and young women are deviating from each other in terms of moral and social values across a range of issues today. Young men and young women seem to have a lot more trouble getting together, forming relationships, getting into marriages, forming families than before. This is a big social problem. Brad Wilcox at his wonderful center at the University of Virginia has a lot of very worrying to me, very dramatic data on this. But it is mostly among our young men that I'm seeing the anti-Semitism. And I'm seeing it on the left, and I'm seeing it on the right. I'm seeing it among secular neo-pagan conservatives, the kinds who follow the Bronze Age pervert. If you don't know who that internet character
But
is, good for you. You don't want to know. But that's a kind of a neo-Nietzschean, neo-pagan, anti-Christian, um, right-wing uh, ideology. And a lot of people who have fallen into that are deeply pronounced, very heavily anti-Semitic. But I'm also seeing it, alas, among Christian young men and particularly among Catholic young men. Now, it tends among the Catholic young men not to be the virulent kill the Jews stuff, thank God, but it is conspiratorial. The Jews are behind the pornography industry. The Jews are getting us into every foreign war. The Jews are the ones who brought abortion. The Jews do this. The Jews do that. Um, it's that conspiratorial thinking, that proneness to fall into conspiracy theories with Jews as the mustache twirling villains in the piece that really, really worries me. And often it's accompanied by theological views that simply are a repudiation of the church's actual teaching. So, you'll have young Catholic men who say, oh, no, no, the Jews didn't accept Jesus and therefore God cursed them and he revoked his covenant with them. And they'll even say things like, the modern Judaism is not the Judaism of the Bible. And no, we all know that, that modern Judaism is not temple Judaism. The temple was destroyed. But, the church has made very clear that the Jewish people continue to be the Jewish people. The Jewish people practice the religion of Judaism. But I'll have young Catholic men tell me that no, that Judaism ended with the destruction of the temple. And so, contemporary Jews are not Jews. Those who practice so-called Judaism are not practicing Judaism. I hear all sorts of stuff like this from these characters, but none of it is compatible with the teaching of the church. When John Paul II went across the city of Rome to that synagogue and that historic act, first time a pope had ever done it, all he had to do was walk a ways across the town. First time a pope ever did it. When he did it, I believe it was 1986. He walked into that
yeah,
synagogue and said, not your ancient ancestors. You are our brothers, and in a sense, indeed, our elder brothers in the faith. Well, you meant you. It means
Thank you.
you, contemporary Jewish people, the Jewish people, are our brothers in faith.
Dr. George, how appropriate to end the program with a reflection on the life of the popes since the council, especially in John Paul II. I wanted to close the program tonight by saying and echoing, really, Dr. George's teaching that it is the Pope and College of Bishops who are the teachers of the church and not media influencers. Father Russ McDougall, the Director of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, said this just recently, quote, "Media influencers are out there claiming to be speaking on behalf of the church, but practicing Catholics know that within the church, it's the Pope in union with the College of Bishops that are the teachers of the church," end quote. Additionally, Dr. George also mentioned an important video by Archbishop Sample at the beginning of our program. He is the chair of the Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Religious Liberty, and he released a video last Wednesday titled "Catholics Must Reject Anti-Semitism," and I am putting it in the chat right now for all of our attendees. And I invite you to take a look at the chat box there, see the link, and click on it. Watch Archbishop Sample's video and perhaps share it with a friend or post it on Facebook. And we would ask you to consider doing that. Dr. George, we are so grateful for your time tonight for this important discussion. It's an honor to have you as a guest, and it's a great privilege of mine just to finally meet you, even though it's an online meeting. Perhaps it can be in person at some point. And
I hope so.
To our online attendees, thank you for joining us. To Dr. Barlavie, thank you for introducing the program. We hope you all have a very wonderful evening. And if you have any comments or questions or feedback, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Barlavie or myself or our administrator, Lori Gens. We thank you very much and have a wonderful night.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you,
George.
everyone. Thank you,
Dr.
Thank
Lori.
you, Benny.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.